All right. So what we got going on here, we're taking a look at the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Johnson is sworn in after the assassination of Lincoln. Lincoln's going to pass away across the street from Ford's Theater. His body will lay in state. He'll be taken by train to Springfield, Illinois. And Andrew Johnson will be sworn in and take the oath of office. So a little bit about him. He's from very poor and humble beginnings in East Tennessee. He was a tailor by trade, self-taught, served in Congress for years, was the only Confederate congressman or Southern congressman from a Confederate state not to leave Congress when the rest of the South seceded. So he was the lone Democrat who hung in there. So he had a short temper, was sort of like a barroom brawler, dueler, like his idol and the political hero that he longed to be, Andrew Jackson, champion of states' rights, and he really is kind of like Clement Blandingham. He's kind of a man without a country. He's not really trusted in the North. He's really kind of run on that 1864 ticket to try to suck votes away from the Peace Democrats. And he really never regained confidence from the South. Here we have Andrew Johnson. Talk a little bit about the black codes. The black codes are really almost seem, let me know when you're ready to rock. Okay. Just need a couple of pieces of paper. Stephen, let me know when you're ready to rock, buddy. You good? All right, just a couple pieces of paper. Bless you. The black codes are really sort of like counterintuitive of the entire process of bringing the war to an end, because as we've already discussed, so much of the contraband had really been under the control of the army, and they had been living, for the most part, a pretty free existence. So they had been living a pretty free existence, and then the war comes to an end, and now one of the questions we posed at the start of the lesson, how are African Americans going to be integrated? So, in order to sort of control the freedmen, a series of black codes are passed, laws that sort of keep the population in submission. They're working in fields. Some of it was harsh. It's really kind of like the slave codes that we talked about earlier in the semester. A lot of African Americans jumped their labor contracts that are established through the black codes, walked off their jobs, but by doing that they were subject to penalties, fines, and their wages were really kept very low. This is going to set the stage for sharecropping, because most of these individuals are going to be barred from renting and leasing land. They're punished for idleness. Many of them are going to have to work on chain gangs. And a lot of the more radical Republicans in the North are saying, why was this war even fought if by freeing these individuals they don't truly have freedom in the end? And again, this not only sets the groundwork for sharecropping, it also sets the groundwork for the Jim Crow laws. So the idea of sharecropping, like we talked about day before yesterday, it's kind of like serfdom, right? Or indentured servitude. You're always kind of tied to the land. You can't ever really buy the land. You don't really own any property. You're just constantly working to survive. And it also felt to them a lot like the slave system, because they are still stuck in around and on, in some cases, on the very same farms that they had been emancipated from. And then we're going to see laws passed by the end of Reconstruction known as Jim Crow laws. I don't know how familiar you are with who Jim Crow is. If you've been with me in my class in the past, I've explained who this person is. The person is not real. He is a minstrel character. He shows up actually during the American Civil War. There were minstrel shows that traveled around and entertained soldiers, sort of like what we would consider maybe the USO, even though there is no USO yet. That's a that we'll talk about that later on down the road when we talk about World War II. But the reality of this is the original actors in the Jim Crow Jubilee and the minstrel shows were African American. And the character Jim Crow is an emancipated African American who believes to be, he himself believes to be articulate, upwardly mobile, well-dressed, and a member of high society and accepted by others. But in reality, he is the punchline. He's not well-dressed, he's in ragged clothes, he's not articulate, he speaks in slang language, and many people can't understand what he's saying. He appears to be ignorant, and he is not well-to-do and not upwardly mobile socially. So this is the name that gets adopted because that's what Jim Crow laws were. They were a contradiction of what the 13th and 14th Amendment laid out. The freedom for slaves and equal rights weren't truly equal through Jim Crow. And then we'll learn later about how Jim Crow is actually upheld and creates really a tragic theme in American history that lasts until the 1960s and 70s. And that makes just really our generations truly the first generations with true equality in this country. So if we look at congressional Reconstruction, do keep in mind that the Republicans, whether they were radical or moderate, they have a stranglehold on policy and policy decision making, and they had come out of the war with a lot of momentum, like the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Tariff Act, the Legal Tender Act. There's like over 30 laws that are passed by the radical Republicans over and the moderates throughout the war. So even though Lincoln is dead, that doesn't change the fact that these folks have are a bit of a tour de force, right? They've worked together. They don't all see eye to eye, but they have controlled the country, and they've done so without much opposition because the Democrats have been out of the picture. So now you've got a sort of impasse, right? Southerners are coming in, are going to have to come back into the Union. These folks want to make sure that they're not back in a situation where African Americans are counting as, 3/5 of the population. They're a whole person, and not only are they going to get equal rights, they're going to get the right to vote and eventually have the right to run for office. So this is a pretty incredible chapter for in American history, and one that needs to be sort of highlighted throughout Reconstruction because of the measures that these Republican congressmen, pushed forward. You're going to have over 300 African Americans elected to Congress, and you're even going to have African Americans elected to the Senate during this era. And what's really crazy is it's like a vacuum, because once Reconstruction ends, it's all just gone. And that's kind of a sort of a chilling part to the end of this lesson that we're going to address. Do keep in mind that Johnson and the Republican Congress are butting heads. Johnson wants the South to re-enter, and by December He believes that the South has met the former Confederate states have met their, sort of met the standard that was set, and that they should be able to re-enter the Union. But the radical Republicans and even the moderates, they want to make sure that these black codes aren't going to continue. They want to make sure that it isn't going to be like an overreach across the nation. And they also want to put up some safeguards as to how the states are going to come back into the Union. Do keep in mind that Johnson is going to do a whole lot with the veto power to try to limit the rights of African Americans. One of those, and this is an interesting cartoon from the era, is to prevent the refunding of the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson wanted that to be blocked. So he used that veto power to prevent it from being refunded. There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. No president in American history up to now, even Andrew Jackson and beyond, will use the veto more than Andrew Johnson. Obviously that, that could potentially happen in the future. Andrew Johnson used the veto, whether it was a pocket veto, line item veto, or just a regular veto, over 25 times. So this is more than Jackson had done, but there's another statistic to think about here too. Never before and never again after, and I don't know, I'm not going to say never, it'll never happen again because you never know, but up to this point in history and to present today, there's never been a Congress that's overridden more vetoes. What's the percentage that it takes in Congress to override a veto? 2/3. 2/3 in the House and in the Senate, right? So the vetoes that he set forth to limit rights ultimately got overridden by Congress. So most of these clashes have to do with civil rights. Civil Rights Bill, refunding the Freedmen's Bureau, passage of the 14th Amendment. These are all just several things, and what that's doing is it's providing equal rights for African Americans. It's also providing some stipulations for the former Confederate states to re-enter the Union. It's also trying to continue to fund the education of African Americans. So with the 13th Amendment, slaves would be free. All states, former Confederate, Union, what have you, had to ratify the 13th Amendment. Then comes the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship, and it also guarantees equal protection under the law. Not only does every state have to ratify the 14th Amendment, all former Confederate states re-entering the Union had to have state conventions to rewrite their state constitutions that included the 13th and the 14th Amendment. This is where Johnson and the Congress butted heads. Ultimately, Congress is going to get its way, and the 14th Amendment will be a requirement. Keep in mind, like Virginia's 1868 Underwood Convention was their convention to re-enter the Union. This also opens up a door for a lot of African Americans to be able to run for state seats, so state legislative seats, like in the Virginia General Assembly or in other state legislatures. So on the left here we have the Civil Rights Bill, and I don't think you all have this on yours, but I added it. That's John Curtis Underwood. He's a New Yorker. People would have considered him what was known as a what? He's not a Virginian by birth, but comes to Virginia as a teacher, takes advantage of Reconstruction.
Carpetbagger?
A carpetbagger, very good. This gentleman would be considered a carpetbagger. He had actually He attended Hamilton College in New York, graduated pretty high up in his class, moved south to become a teacher. Ironically enough, he taught Thomas J. Jackson's family, Stonewall Jackson's family, in Clarksburg, Virginia, now West Virginia. He makes his way to Richmond, gets a position as a justice, and he was an outspoken abolitionist. He is the guy that leads the convention to bring Virginia back into the Union. That's why it is called the Underwood Convention. So when you're thinking like, what's the, like, where, like, how do we define a carpetbagger? That would be the definition of a carpetbagger. Somebody that had come from the north and took advantage of the political landscape in the South. So not all carpetbaggers were taking advantage of the South financially. Some carpetbaggers were taking advantage of the opportunity to do some good, right? To pass the 13th and 14th Amendment, to bring Virginia back into the Union. That's what John Curtis Underwood was doing. We'll talk a little bit more about carpetbaggers as we move forward. So Johnson has a couple of things going on. He's fighting vehemently against the 14th Amendment, but he's also trying to figure out how he's going to get reelected. So he starts to go on this sort of whistle-stop tour where he goes by rail to different places to give like campaign speeches. They called this series of campaign speeches the Round the Circle speeches. But they also became known as the Give 'em Hell speeches because he would get out in front of an audience and it's sort of like very, I would say, Trump-esque, where a heckler gets the best. I mean, we've seen Trump react to hecklers in the crowd, right? Well, Johnson would have done the exact same thing. Same deal that Andrew Jackson. We're talking about a person with a fiery temper. And they're not the only three presidents that we've ever elected with a fiery temper that takes on the crowd. So in these particular speeches, he's given a speech, he's getting heckled, and he starts giving it back to him, right? Another guy that comes to mind would be Teddy Roosevelt. He gets heckled in the speech. He got shot during one of his speeches and kept on going. So the Give 'em Hell speeches actually sort of backfired because more Republicans end up getting elected and it creates even more opposition for him. So this is sort of Johnson at the dawn of his impeachment. Now, there's a pretty significant level of irony with Johnson. Johnson believes in the strict construction of the Constitution. Remember, old hardline Democrats back to the founding of the party were all about strict construction, right? So Johnson was all about that. But what this particular House and Senate are going to do, they're going to set a trap that is going to be laid that he'll walk right into, and it'll basically lead to his demise, his impeachment trial, and ultimately the end of his political career. So here we have Johnson stepping up on the stool. This little boy would persist in handling books above his capacity. And this was the disastrous result. So essentially what they're referring to is the reason that he's impeached is because even though he talked about the fact that he understood the Constitution, in reality, the Constitution is going to kind of come back to bite him. So let's take a look at the impeachment itself. Congress passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Now keep in mind, Johnson does not have a cabinet that he has put in line. He's inherited Lincoln's cabinet. Therefore, there are people in Lincoln's cabinet that Johnson does not agree with. There are people in Lincoln's cabinet that have a whole heck of a lot more political prestige than he does. A couple of them that we can name off the top of our head would be Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Secretary of State William Seward. So they know that Johnson wants Edwin Stanton out, the Secretary of War. And Stanton is really kind of like a bit of a spy for the Republican radicals. So this particular act is passed. What do you think Johnson did to the act? He vetoed it. Very good. He vetoed it, but they overrode his veto. He ultimately stepped into the trap. He removes Edwin Stanton from office without consent of Congress, the very law they created. With that, he tries to replace him with Lorenzo Thomas, and now they have grounds for impeachment. So really what happens here is Johnson's set up. This is another really great political cartoon. It's got the War Office. It's got Edwin Stanton, or Ulysses S. Grant, the Mystery Man. This was published in Harper's Weekly. Edwin Stanton ready to ram home the projectile cannon being Congress, and tied back to back there are Lorenzo Thomas, the guy that was supposed to replace Stanton, and Andrew Johnson. So the impeachment trial, do you have a question? What's up? Yeah. Well, interesting. Yeah. And what's wild too is that there's so much speculation on who the mystery man is. All right, so this is one of the most popular tickets to get of the era. A ticket to the impeachment trial. It's similar to the Republic National Convention that we talked about in Chicago, where Lincoln's on the third ballot, right? In 1860, for the election of 1860, he gets nominated. Well, people are selling counterfeit tickets. People are scalping tickets to the impeachment trial. This impeachment trial, there's a couple of reasons why he does not get impeached. Number one is his lawyers won't let him testify due to the Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. The other issue here is that through the trial, there are enough senators who sort of say, you know what, we really did kind of set this guy up. So their conscience got the best of them, and they said, we're going to hold back. And within a narrow vote, just one vote, he is not impeached. And the 7 that did not vote, or that voted not guilty, that ended their political careers. So this infuriated the radicals, but at the end of the day, like, the damage was done, right? His career is over, and now the Republicans can start moving. Here we have the impeachment trial. Now the Republicans can start moving in the direction that I love them sitting here in the trial. It's funny. They can start moving in the direction of where they want to go. So where do they want to go? What do they want? What do the Republicans want in a candidate? Any ideas? Somebody that's not racist is really good. That's awesome. That is because Johnson might arguably be one of the most racist presidents of all time. And that's a tall order, right? We've had a lot of racist presidents. So very good. Not a president that is not racist. What else? What do the radicals and even the moderates want? They want somebody that they can do what with? Manipulate. They also want somebody that they both groups can agree upon. So who would be the perfect middleman that the moderates and the radicals, very good, Ulysses S. Grant. Awesome. Probably not bad. Yeah, very good. So Ulysses S. Grant is the direction that they're going to go in. All right. So the Republican compromise here, they come together to basically bring about a plan for the South to re-enter the Union. They'll have to pass the 13th and 14th Amendment, and they will not be able to do so until they've rewritten state constitutions. In the meantime, those southern states are going to have to be under military occupation. So that's the direction they're going to move in as Johnson is out and Grant is coming in. Furthermore, there are two leading members of the House and the Senate that dictate the agenda through Reconstruction. And that is Thaddeus Stevens in the House from Pennsylvania and Charles Sumner, who has recovered from his beating from Preston Brooks from Massachusetts. So these two are going to be the two players in the Reconstruction game in Congress. And clearly, Ulysses S. Grant will come in and be elected 18th president. So that's going to be the election of 1868. So that's the direction that we're heading in. So here we have Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. So the South is going to be broken up into 5 military districts, like Hunger Games style. All right? District 1, Virginia. The other southern states will be broken into other districts. Only one southern state re-entered fast enough not to have to be under military occupation, and that's going to be the state of Tennessee. So, here's the contingency. States will ratify the 13th, states will ratify the 14th, and states will also ratify the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment will allow for suffrage or voting rights or the franchise for African American men. Sorry, ladies, still no vote yet. This is where Susan B. Anthony comes on the scene and goes to vote for Ulysses S. Grant and is arrested. That does not surprise me. We also have a groundbreaking case I wanted to point out too, Ex parte Milligan. Milligan was a judge who was caught up in a conspiracy scandal, and in this court, it ruled that military tribunals could not try civilians, even during wartime. This case ultimately protects civilians in time of war. Keep in mind that this is going to grind on and sort of drag on till the end of Reconstruction in 1877. Not every state, notably South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, not all these states are going to re-enter or want to re-enter quickly. They are going to let it drag out on purpose. So, here we have your military districts, District 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then if you see here at the bottom, who is in command of each district? These are all former generals that we've talked about. I don't know if we talked about General Schofield. We definitely talked about Dan Sickles. We talked about John Pope. Did we talk about General Ord? No. Not, I don't think so. And certainly we talked about Phil Sheridan this semester. And then we have the 15th Amendment. This is another cartoon in Harper's Weekly. And this primary document shows you African American voting for the first time. Well, what's different about this voting process that we wouldn't experience at the ballot box?
Understand that two things, like first, it's public.
Yeah, it's totally public.
Also, the third person in the line is wearing military uniform.
Yeah, so it's totally public. It's kind of trying to show you all walks of life here, going to the ballot box. Graham brought up a good point, literacy tests. Those have not quite yet been passed yet, but the literacy tests and the poll taxes are not far off from here.
Did their vote pass the full vote?
Yes, it did. That's a good question. That actually, the African American vote swings and sways the vote for Ulysses S. Grant in both elections. All right. Let's see here. All right, this is where we'll pump the brakes for today. So the realities of radical Reconstruction, African Americans start to organize in groups like the Union League that were kind of born out of the Freedmen's Bureau. They get involved in political clubs. They start to take advantage of educational opportunities. So this is where the Moral Land Grant Act comes into play. Historically black colleges are going to be established by the leader of or spearheaded by the leader of the Freedmen's Bureau, Oliver O. Howard, who was a Union general. So colleges like Howard, Hampton, Virginia Union, Virginia State, and then later Tuskegee and other historically black colleges are going to be established for African Americans to be educated. African Americans are going to come into political office. Guys like Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce served in Congress, and then obviously in the Senate and the House. We talked about Robert Smalls, the Union naval captain, who was also the guy that stole a Confederate ship. He was also involved. There's also another political group that needs to be mentioned, and probably one of the most prominent of this group would have been Confederate General James Longstreet. This group are people that served in the Confederacy, but they wanted to rejoin the Union, and by coming back and rejoining the Union, they decided to join the Republican Party. This group of people became known as scalawags. So Longstreet, honestly, the history of James Longstreet has really only, like the man's real story and the truth of his history is only probably about 30 years old, because for about just under 100 years, because of him becoming a scalawag, he was sort of painted as the man that lost Gettysburg. He was painted when we realized he was the guy that was trying to prevent the attack at Gettysburg. Him going to the Republican side after the war was blasphemous in the eyes of the former Confederates, especially the Virginians. The Virginians felt so betrayed by Longstreet for becoming a scalawag. And he's not the only one. There are a number of other scalawags. And even there's a group that I talked to you about the day before yesterday that sort of like kind of fell into the scalawag category, but they weren't really scalawags. And that group became known as the Readjuster Party. And they were led by a Confederate general by the name of William Billy Mahone, who was the Confederate general in command at the Battle of the Crater. What they decided was, they said, look, you know what we need to do? We need to provide educational opportunities for African Americans, poor whites, and we also need to use tax subsidies to help rebuild Virginia, rebuild railroads, rebuild roads, rebuild bridges. And they actually had about a 10-year period where they got seats in the General Assembly and got some seats in the House and the Senate, but they ultimately fell apart due to pressures by the old guard Democrats who wanted to go back to the status quo. The people that were against the scalawags and wanted to go back to the status quo, we call those people redeemers. They want to redeem what was the old South. Question, what's up, buddy?
I actually read once, because they gave out Confederate statues. there's only one statue of Longstreet in the entire South, because when the statues were being put up by like the United Artists and Confederacy and stuff, he was seen as a traitor. So
Yeah.
there's only one statue.
Interesting. And is that statue in Tennessee?
I forgot.
Okay.
Probably right
Yeah, I'd like to look that up. That's interesting. Very interesting. All right. And then, of course, carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers are a number of different people. You could be called a carpetbagger if you were a woman trying to come down and educate someone in the freedom era. You could be a carpetbagger if you were trying to come down and take advantage of a political office. You could be a carpetbagger if you were trying to actually try to buy land and rebuild. The idea of a carpetbagger, that was sort of like a disgraceful term. If you had a carpetbag, that meant you cut a piece of carpet, folded it together, sewed up the sides, put a handle on it, and we're on the go. And they've got like this depiction of like, people jamming money in these carpet bags and like coming down to the South and buying devastated land for pennies on the dollar. In parts of cities like Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina, that have to be rebuilt as a result of that. Like carpetbaggers sort of get, even though they do a lot of good, they're sort of reviled for coming down to rebuild. And then in some cases, and I look forward to you giving us this answer in a second. In some cases, like in the real deep South, when Reconstruction comes to an end, carpetbaggers that had gone down there to take advantage of politics, like a lot of people due to the military occupation that were like former Union generals, they go down and start running for political office. Well, in places like Louisiana, those folks after Reconstruction end, they just disappeared. And no one said anything. So it was a very interesting scenario during that era of Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. What's up?
Longstreet statue in Georgia.
Georgia. Interesting. Where?
Gainesville, I think.
Gainesville, Georgia. Interesting.
Somewhere around
All right. Here we have our first African American senators and members of the House of Representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress. And then we have a depiction on the left of a carpetbagger, and on the right, a scalawag. Southern types, the wolf, and the land in politics.
Who is supposed to be what?
What they're referring to is that this guy on the right is a scalawag because he has moved to the Republican Party and he's trying to appeal to this African American for his vote. And then the carpetbagger on the left, this is a famous cartoon from a famous cartoonist from the era. His name is Thomas Nast. You all probably became familiar with him last year because he's the guy that exposed Boss Tweed. He is a cartoonist mainly for the publication we've been talking a lot about, Harper's Weekly. All right, it's a good place for us to stop today. I'm going to wrap everything up tomorrow. You guys have any questions for me? All right.